In this video, I'll be walking through the steps I took to construct this rustic, functional, extremely inexpensive nest box for robins. The design for this nest box, originally created by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, called for the use of a cedar 1x10. Recognizing the relatively high cost of such material, the frugal, creative folks at the website growitbuildit.com modified the plan such that the box could be constructed with a single, dog-eared cedar fence picket. These can be purchased at many big box home improvement centers for about $4. Sometimes finding a high-quality cedar fence picket can be a challenge. The boards are frequently bowed, occasionally twisted, and almost always cupped. But that's okay. These imperfections can be worked around, and I'm pretty sure the robins won't mind. With the fence picket in hand, I start by cutting the parts to length. The plans call for 2 pieces at 13 inches, 2 pieces at 8.5 inches, 2 at 8 inches, and 1 at 7 inches. Now from one of the 8.5-inch long pieces, I'm going to rip 2 pieces that are 2.5 inches wide, and then I'm going to cut one of those down to 7 inches in length. Now it's time for some edge gluing. The 7 by 2.5 inch strip gets glued to the 7 by 5.5 inch piece. The 8.5 by 2.5 inch strip gets glued to the 8.5 by 5.5 inch piece, and the two 13-inch long pieces get glued together. Because I'm not jointing, planing, or otherwise preparing the boards, these edge joints, as well as the other joints involved in this project, will be far from perfect. To compensate for this, I'm using an exterior-grade construction adhesive, which, unlike traditional woodworking glue, is capable of bridging significant gaps between the pieces. For a work surface, I'm using a flat piece of plywood covered with some parchment paper, so the pieces being glued don't end up stuck to the work area. I apply a pretty generous bead of construction adhesive to the mating edge of each piece and try to even out the coverage with a small brush. I then press the 2 pieces together and apply a couple of clamps. I like to double-check the side-to-side alignment of the pieces at this point, as sometimes the clamping pressure will cause them to squirm. Finally, I put a weight on top of the pieces to help ensure they stay flat and allow the adhesive to set. Next, I cut out the profile of the side pieces. The PDF from growitbuildit.com includes the profile dimensions as well as a printable template. With the template positioned on the wood, I transferred the cut lines. In order to keep the roof line as straight as possible, I made that cut on a table saw. The angle is 18.5 degrees, so I set the miter gauge to 71.5 degrees. For the other 2 cuts, I used a jigsaw. While these cuts do make the nest box a bit more aesthetically pleasing, I'm not certain it makes it any more appealing to the birds, so strictly from that standpoint, the profile probably isn't even necessary. To aid in the assembly of the box, I made a primitive jig by clamping a couple of 2x4s to a table, leaving an 8-inch gap between them. The side pieces were then clamped to the 2x4s, and the bottom glued in place. In this instance, clamping the bottom to the sides would have been a bit awkward, so I decided to use a few screws to hold the pieces together. I broke down the jig quickly, so the nest box parts wouldn't become stuck to it. Next, I laid the back piece of the nest box on the table, positioned the side and floor assembly in the desired location, and clamped down a few pieces of scrap to serve as a placement guide. After applying adhesive and initial pressure, I placed a weight on top of the sides and a few clamps on the floor and removed the guide pieces. All that remained was to attach the roof, but first the back edge of that piece needed to be beveled, so I went back to the table saw, tilted the head to 18.5 degrees, and cut off as little material as necessary. After a generous application of adhesive, I pressed the parts together, and this time, instead of clamping, screwing, or using weights, simply applied manual force for a minute or 2. I was pleasantly surprised to find that this seemed adequate to achieve good initial bond. 24 hours later, the nest box was mounted and ready for occupancy.